Hello there, and thanks for tuning in. Today, and over the next few weeks, we'll be doing things a little differently. Many of you, especially those who are not yet experienced higher ed coaches, may have been wondering what everything we've been talking about in this podcast looks like in real life. And most importantly, what makes a truly successful coaching engagement in the higher ed context. For this reason, I've invited some professional coaches and their clients to the show to provide some insights into their process, experience, and ways they have helped their coachees. And one of them will be my own. So let's see what we can learn from our guests about what makes working with higher ed professionals truly great and meaningful. Hello, I'm Tim Jansa, a leadership and organizational development coach, and your host for Coaching in Higher Education, the go-to podcast for coaching professionals and those interested in coaching at colleges and universities. My guests today are Katie Toro-Ferrari, who serves as Senior Associate Dean of Student Affairs for Student Engagement and Leadership, and her coach, Dr. Kate McCaffrey of Paradigm Twist Executive Coaching and Consulting, with whom I had the pleasure of speaking on this podcast in Season 1. So check out that episode as well. So welcome to the podcast, Katie, and welcome back, Kate. And thank you both for taking the time to tell your story and share your experience.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to be back again, Tim. Thank you.
The coach-client relationship is so very, very important for any engagement that we work in. And in talking to the two of you initially, I could sense immediately that you really hit it off. Katie, how did your working with Kate come about, and what was it that made you say yes to this particular coaching engagement?
I guess there's some backstory to all of this, which is I'd had a pretty intense year in the build up to working with Kate. My supervisor of the years beforehand had retired, and so we welcomed a new VP for Student Affairs at my institution. And I was managing a lot of areas that felt like they were constantly on fire, which is a feeling I know a lot of my colleagues in Student Affairs can relate to. And so at the end of the year, my new supervisor at the time, I think very correctly determined that I was a good candidate for some TLC in the form of professional coaching. And, he offered me the opportunity to work with Kate. It was really teed up as a chance to get my feet under me again and kind of reset after, like I said, a very intense year, but also start thinking about the vision for the way forward after a lot of tumult and transition. And so he graciously set us up over email, I think. And then we reached just like an initial conversation. And I think I'd had the benefit of working with coaches in other moments of my life. One of the things that I really appreciate about Kate, beyond just like I think the personal connection, was the fact that she was coming from this very same field that I was working in and instantly had, there was a lot that I didn't have to explain. That was new for me. And it felt lovely to start a relationship like this from a place of like validating and like not having to explain myself too much and just knowing that the person just gets it.
Yeah, Katie, why did your supervisor choose coaching as a developmental pathway? A lot of times when people struggle, there's these short-term interventions. I'm wondering, why did he choose to coaching?
I never asked him that question, but I think it might have something to do with the fact that I had made it pretty clear in the time working together that I didn't really want to take a class. I didn't want to go to a conference. I didn't want to be a part of a cohort. Like, I think there was a sense of just kind of being exhausted. And I think there was something about that particular intervention that felt like it would not only be aligned with what he wants me to be able to do on the job, but also, and what I want to be able to do on the job, but also with just getting me back to a more sustainable place. And I think there's something about the coaching relationship, like having a person who is for you, and that just feels different than some of the other interventions. But maybe you talk to him about that, Kate. I don't know.
Yeah, Kate, I was wondering, what was your perspective on how this engagement started? And especially, I think it'd be interesting to see and to hear from you where you saw Katie, where she was when you started, and where she wanted to go, and which direction this whole thing took.
Yeah. So as Katie mentioned, I know her vice president and have known for years. And so have been in touch mostly through other organizations like NASPA, conferences, those kinds of things. And we worked pretty closely on campuses that were near to each other. And so when he first approached me, it was at a conference and said, hey, I have people in my team that I think could really benefit from coaching. What does that look like? And so that's when the first initial conversation happened. And then part of it was too, for me, in my own experience, I can recognize when there's that need. And I often say that I do what I do because I wish I had someone like me when I was doing like what Katie was doing. Because I think had I had that, I would have had different experiences throughout my career. Because once you hit a senior leader level, I think it's really challenging to be able to navigate many of the things that happen. And the expectations, especially on smaller campuses, is you have to be able just to sort of bounce and do what you need to do. And I think that perspective, it sounds like from what Katie even just said, just really resonated with her and with my approach to coaching based on the need to kind of have somebody as an outside perspective to be able to talk through some of what had happened. I think what I find myself doing a lot is sort of unpacking what has occurred over the last few years for many. And, since 2019, 2020, everyone is sort of still recovering. I think it takes a long time, especially if you don't take the time. And I think part of what I've been able to do in some ways with Katie and other clients is just really unpack that as part of a recovery process almost, and sort of calibrating, okay, who do I want to be as a professional and how do I get there?
So what I'm hearing is, Kate, you having a similar background provided a platform from which you could develop an immediate mutual understanding versus somebody who would have come in with a completely different background, because we're always talking about in coaching, any coach can coach anywhere. And I don't know if that's really true in higher education. It certainly adds a level of connection when you come in from an environment where you can truly relate to what your client is going through, right, Katie?
I mean, just a thought about that. I feel like it's worth noting, I didn't come up in higher ed. That's not what I did my master's in. And I took a break from my career in higher ed for a while. And so I've always been actually quite biased towards getting perspectives from outside of higher ed. And I can't say this enough, how much for this particular engagement, it actually was unbelievably valuable to have that insider knowledge and connection. I feel like I'm always the person who's skeptical saying, well, like it's good to welcome in other, right? But like there's just something about knowing what it's like that makes a huge difference.
Please pardon the interruption. This is your friendly reminder that if you're enjoying today's episode, to please click like and to subscribe to the podcast. Your support is really important to us. Also, please check out the companion website, higheredcoaching.us or leadershipimagined.com/podcast. And now back to the episode. You mentioned, Katie, your supervisor earlier. Did he function as a sponsor, like an official sponsor for this engagement, or what was his involvement?
Yeah, you've got that right. I think there's always a risk, which I'll just name, which maybe we've danced around, but just the idea of coaching as like a performance improvement correction, as a development intervention. And I think the fact that he said from the very beginning, it was like, I'm investing in you. This is where this is coming from, as an opportunity for me to really be able to leap growth and get to the place where I was feeling vulnerable, because I wasn't worried about necessarily where that was going to go. It was really rooted in the idea of building me up.
Kate, in this particular constellation or dynamic, how did you ensure confidentiality, psychological safety, and all these things that are so essential to a successful coaching engagement? And how was it working with this particular sponsor?
Given that there was already a relationship, there was trust there. And I think that that's valuable from a professional standpoint. And I think being very clear, both in verbal communication and in writing. So I have a contract that my clients sign around what confidentiality is, what it means in this relationship. And I think that conversation, doing that early on and having it be part of the initial agreement, creates that psychological safety of, it takes time to build trust and to build that type of safety. But I think at the same time, just being outright about it initially is really valuable too. And I think encouraging Katie to have that conversation with her supervisor too was important as part of the process of, okay, you're being invested by someone at an institution. What do you want them to know about this? And what does that look like? And then understanding the role that it can play in having a partner or an ally in the process is valuable too. So I think it's about, what do you as the client want to have the person who's sponsoring you know? And then are there ways that I can support that? And I think we'll talk a little bit about how we worked as a team as part of the process too.
Yeah, because I can see, Katie, you mentioned earlier and also in our first conversation that the 2024-25 academic year was difficult, right? And you said that you came out of that academic year, feeling beat down. So what were those primary stressors? What are the things that you really wanted to tackle when you first started with Kate, and how did you articulate that to her?
I'm trying to put myself back in that spot. I think probably the best way for me to put it, and then just thinking about the work, where the work started with Kate, is I feel like the strategies that I had leveraged to be successful this far in my career were no longer serving me. They just weren't. And a lot of this is pretty predictable stuff. Like you make the jump, you increasingly climb up the ladder, you get more and more areas to supervise, and you just can't do everything to the standards you want them to. And you also don't want to. I mean, that's not the kind of boss that I want to be, the supervisor that I want to be. But I also think, as Kate was alluding to, I feel like in higher ed and maybe in the world too, things haven't quite come back the way that they maybe were before the pandemic. And so there is inherently a lack of trust in the world on college campuses. There's no exception to that. And the definitions that I had of what success looked like, managing these areas in this time, needed to be revisited, shall we say.
So it seems to me like this was a little bit of uncharted territory for you, Katie, because you said that, what you had been doing previously just didn't serve you anymore at this point. So, Kate, I'm wondering, how did you get started with her and help Katie explore and grow into this area that was kind of a black box or kind of nebulous? Like, did you do an assessment? Did you provide some frameworks? What was your approach to this?
So first, I think it's about that awareness. When someone comes in like Katie with, this isn't working anymore and I need something different, that's helpful to start. Not everyone comes to us that way, I think. Tim, you can probably resonate with that. So sometimes it's how do you help people reflect and understand where they're at and what they might need. And then that is where potentially assessments might be helpful. Katie was open pretty quickly to a 360 process. And I think that's one tool that coaches use often to help a leader both understand for themselves, right? What's going well, what's challenging, and where are some areas where I really want to change or grow or learn new ways of being a leader. And I think for the people around them to have that opportunity to share insights can both be very vulnerable and scary. And at the same time can really help us hone in pretty quickly on, okay, here's what's happening from how people are perceiving you. And here's where you see there's some challenges. And so Katie was pretty open to that more quickly than I thought she would be, to be honest. And I think more than her supervisor thought she would be. And I think that helped the process move pretty quickly in identifying some areas where there were some specific things that could be done from a behavior standpoint and a reflection standpoint to make some of those changes.
And you used Leadership Circle, right?
The Leadership Circle profile is a tool that allows both personal reflection, but then also literally a 360. So it's peer-based, boss's boss, colleagues. And I think we added a few students who had worked with Katie as well. What I like about it is it's a really deep dive into the behavior, and the model is all around sort of competency and tendency. So we all have competencies, and then we all have behavioral tendencies. And so it helps identify it from a strengths-based approach too, but also an understanding of, okay, here's how I perceive myself, but then here's how other people perceive myself. So it shows you patterns in a very research-based way that I think gives a model. It's a circle, literally, and around the circle are all these behaviors that are listed. And then you can really see in an actual kind of graph, okay, here's where I rate myself in this particular area, competency or tendency. And then here's where other people rate me, both from a number and a visual. You can see it. And I think that was a great way to start the conversation. I think the timing of that was also important, both for Katie and for colleagues around her. I think we ended up doing it. It might have been at the end of a semester or the very beginning of a semester too. So it wasn't like this time of year we're asking people to take 20 minutes and do a survey about their boss or about their supervisee. So the timing matters in that, both in the process for coaching and in the process for what's happening in the world around them at that point, so that you get some of the best data that you can.
Katie, how was that experience for you? Did you have any trepidations or certain expectations that were met or not met, or just walk us through that?
Yeah, I mean, again, Kate said this a few times, but I think my dial is set to pretty open about this stuff in general, which helped. I think it's hard if you have to get to that place where you're a little bit more open, but I was really relieved actually when that was one of the things that Kate started with, because I felt like, having done 360s before, one of the great benefits is, more often than not, they affirm things that feel important to you about how you want to be perceived and the impact that you have on people, hopefully. But then they also offer you just breadcrumbs and sometimes full blown like signs about things that probably need to change if you want to continue to be successful. Again, having done other 360s, the thing that I actually really liked about the leadership circle profile that was different was this piece around how you're perceived by these multiple layers of individuals in the organization. One real insight for me was just the pretty staggering delta in how my supervisor was perceiving me and how my direct reports were perceiving me, that I think indicated a big piece for me that was like, I'm working with somebody new. They don't inherently know what my strengths are. They don't inherently see some of the value that I bring. And so I think that's something, again, that I was like, shift to a different stage in my career. I need to do a better job of managing up and down, not just in terms of getting tasks done, but also in terms of telling the story of like the impact that I'm having and that my areas are having. And so it's like one concrete example, but I don't know that I would have gotten that from like your run of the mill, like, let's get a bunch of questions and get some input from people. The evidence-based and scientific approach really helped paint that picture. And I'll be honest, it didn't feel great.
Kate, how did you help Katie pour all this into goals for the engagement? Because I mean, that's, I find, sometimes is the hardest thing for a coach. You have a client who, they're in a difficult spot, but they don't necessarily have a deep or clear understanding of where they want to be, where they want to go, and then just to kind of help them channel this and funnel this into some goals. What was your experience in this?
Yeah, I think it takes time, right? I think it's both sitting with like the data, I guess we're talking about it. It's a 20-page interactive PDF that you get, both with comments from people and graphs that include numbers from them and numbers from yourself. And I think it's a lot to deal with. And I remember when I did it as part of my certification too, I was like, this is a lot of information and it's almost too much information, I think, all at once. And so really just breaking it down into pieces and then prioritizing from there. What is it showing us? What is it showing you based on what we've already sort of identified as areas where there might be some challenges or room for changes? What are the priorities? Because we can't do 25 things differently all at once, right? So how do we pick just one or two that will potentially have the biggest impact more quickly? Because I think that's a valuable part of a process when it comes to coaching is you can't wait weeks for this type of change to happen. Even though it may have taken months for us to get to where we are, it can't take that long, especially when it's this type of engagement or you're in this kind of a fast-paced environment. People, especially too, if they've been involved in this, they want to see something from it. I'm like, I invested in you and providing you this feedback. So there's a communication process that happens back to people. How do we identify what these goals might be? And then what are we willing to share and feel okay sharing? And then it's what do I have as far as tools or resources that I can share with my clients around, okay, if you want to be able to show up in a place not feeling like you're on fire too. And that's an analogy I think Katie and I use and I've used with other clients. And I think it's about, okay, so what do I do before I walk into that space? And how do I take some moments to be able to recalibrate myself before I go into a conversation or before I go into a meeting, depending on what it is. And so part of our conversations would be, okay, so how does this information apply to what you want to do? And then how do we create some different ways of shifting your mindset prior to an engagement with somebody or something or a group of people? And then how do we build those practices as part of the daily routine? And I think Katie could speak to this too, but what it showed in some ways, and it has shown for others that I've done it with, is I just need to take a beat and really kind of just take a couple of minutes before I engage in a conversation or in a meeting or whatever I'm doing and think about how do I want to show up and be more intentional. And so I think that's where this process of the profile can help you just be more intentional more quickly than it would talking through without the data. it would take us a lot longer, I think, to identify where there might be some areas for quick wins around changes, both for the client, for Katie in this instance, and for those around her.
I'm always fascinated by the dynamics and the psychology working with clients who have gone through a different period in their career at their institution. I mean, sometimes we work with clients who also have some personal issues that come in. And I'm wondering, Katie, for you, what was most effective that Kate did to help you have that space to calm down? Because I know there are these expectations to yourself, to others. Your nervous system a lot of times is really heightened. You've been under a lot of stress. What technique or tools did Kate use that had the best and the most impact for you?
It's such a great question. And I think once we got through this 360 kind of sense making, starting to think about like goals and priorities, I just feel like every time we had a session, I knew I would have the chance to verbalize something that I was struggling with that connected to some of the goals that I had, and that Kate would help me slow things down. She would help me metabolize it. She would offer a different perspective, but also connect me to the intentions that I had set for myself. I would always come out with a sharper sense of like an action that I wanted to take. So I feel like there was something in that structure of our conversations. I just think this piece around slowing down, remembering what's important and what's the priority, and then being able to talk through strategies. You just come out of it feeling much better prepared. And even if the outcome doesn't necessarily go the way you want it to, just even setting that intention and thinking through the possibilities, it just made a world of difference. So I don't know. What do you call that technique? I mean, I think that's called coaching, right?
I was just about to say, I think this is the power that coaching offers over other developmental activities. It's not somebody who's there, who's listened to you, writes a report, then tells you what you need to do. That dynamic is this listening, speaking, giving you space and giving you an opportunity to explore different areas and different directions that work for you at that time. And it's not some kind of prescribed approach. I think that's what's beautiful about this particular approach. Kate, I wanted to ask you, since we touched on that briefly earlier, there was a sponsor involved. So there were basically three of you. What was the dynamics there with the sponsor, with part of this engagement? And what advice may you have for other coaches who work not just one-on-one with a client, but who also have a sponsor in the mix?
Mm-hmm. So I think being available to the sponsor can be helpful. And I've done that in a few different scenarios. But I also think drawing a line too. So sometimes you're helping the sponsor learn more about my coachee, their supervisee too. And how do I manage through this behavior when I know you're working on trying to change it? And to be honest with Katie, that didn't happen very often. And her sponsor was involved in the initial part of the process with the leadership circle profile, because part of that process is a pre-meeting with the sponsor to be able to, as a team, think about, okay, here's what we hope this will give us from an assessment standpoint, from a process standpoint. Because it's a big investment, both in resources and time, as well as it opens up, right? I think a 360 of any kind opens up potential things we didn't know in the process. And so I always try and have that conversation ahead of time with both the coachee and their sponsor. And then after it's done, there's a conversation that happens again, now that we have the data, and really kind of going through, okay, here are the themes, here are the priorities that we see based on this experience. Is there alignment with that information with the sponsor in order to be able to help the coachee set some goals and to be intentional about that? Because if someone's sponsoring this process, they want to see something from the outset of it, from the outcome. And so I think, how do you engage in that as almost like a team effort? And then, to be honest, there's little communication that I have with sponsors after that, unless there's something that happens, or if I'm coaching them too. Sometimes I'm in a position, which this is a whole other podcast episode, but when I'm also coaching a manager and a supervisee, because I think that can be challenging because you're helping them understand each other, but then also helping them both grow at the same time. And so this wasn't the case with Katie and her sponsor. It was more of a very hands-off, respected the process, respected her confidentiality. There were a couple of times when I would encourage her to talk with him about whatever was going on in order to kind of either get the feedback that she was looking for or to get insight on a situation. But at the same time, I think he was really looking for her to recalibrate, get a better foundation under her for what was coming next, and engage with her team in a different way.
So what I'm hearing is process and boundaries. So of course, some of those assessments, some of those tools that we use as coaches, they have a process built in as you just described.
Right.
But I think just make very clear from the get-go of where the boundaries are. So for example, the client can share basically what she or he wishes with the sponsor, but we as coaches, of course, we are bound by the confidentiality that we have to keep unless the client specifically asks us to. I once coached a client who was brought to me as a simple one-on-one engagement without a sponsor involved. Had I known then what I found out over the course of a couple of months, I probably would have insisted of having that other person come in and be part of the discussion. So I think it's very important that we understand the dynamics of whose responsibilities lies where and where some opportunities are for improvement, because none of our clients operates in a vacuum.
Right.
In a silo, right? There are always other people. And I think this is the beauty of using an assessment like Leadership Circle, for example, where you get a much more holistic and systems
for sure.
picture of what your client is going through. So I'm wondering, what were some moments that stick out to you now that you think back to your engagement, Katie? And I'd love to start with you. Were there like one or two times when Kate might have asked you a question or mentioned something or brought in some data and a tool where you said, oh my God, this changes everything for me, or at least changes things sufficiently?
The short answer is yes.
Okay.
There were several of those moments, and I'm trying to think. Okay, I thought of an example. We implemented a new meeting structure for my directors this fall. It didn't go very well. We'll just put it that way. Again, stressful times. I think a lot of my team has been the tip of the spear for things that are roiling higher ed. And so those sessions mostly felt pretty much like a big gripe session. And I've got a lot of talkers on my team who are great, but also it's hard to have what one might call like a focused and like efficient and productive meeting where you're trying to like get something done or push it forward. And so talking to Kate, she basically helped me think about how to put it back on them to say, like, I actually need you to step up and help us think about, you said you wanted these meetings, so how do you think they're going? And once we've established that, what are you going to do to change this pattern that we've set? And so it's just not something that I ever would have considered. And I ended up approaching it that way. And it was a great meeting.
Kate, was there something that sticks out to you when you think back to your work with Katie, where you had to feel like this just really moved the needle this moment?
I don't know if there's anything necessarily specific, but I think part of what I appreciated about the work with Katie is that she was willing to share. So understanding, okay, so what was it about this dynamic on the team in the meetings? And it took us a bit. And I think part of what we do in coaching too is help people name it or name it for them. And I think to be able to see the reaction of what was happening, both from a physical standpoint on the screen, even with Katie, and then also being able to think about, in some ways, what could potentially be happening with others, right? Knowing that they were part of this process initially. And I think people are the hardest thing to change, but yet we expect it to happen quickly. And so I'm not surprised to hear that, it's not fully rehabilitated yet. And it just takes time. And sometimes I think it's about what can we just let go of, right? And I think for Katie, it was, you don't have to own that. You're not the only person there, and it's not yours to necessarily direct if you're not the one who wants the meetings, but your team does. So what do they need from that? And how can you tap people on the team to be able to help manage that too? Because I think we can't do this leadership thing alone. And if we have people that we have as allies in a process, when it comes to changing culture, and I think that's what we were talking about, is that really wanting to change the culture of the team, which is really hard because people have been there from 6 months to 17 years, right? And I think that's when you bring a group like that together, there's a dynamic of old and then there's a newer dynamic, and they sometimes are in conflict with each other. And based on the experiences they had had together and the changes that had occurred both in leadership and in structure at the institution, there was an opportunity, I think, too, to really think about what do we want to get out of our time together, and helping Katie just take a step back and be like, this isn't a priority for me. They want this. And so then how do you help them own that time in that process? Still having the strategy and the goals and the priorities in mind, but also I don't know that someone in the role of manager or supervisor always has to be the one running a meeting. That's just not a belief I have. And so I think being able to share that, what gave Katie some relief of, I don't have to micromanage this.
Mhm.
Someone else can do it. And that's hard, I think, when you're in a role and you have a title and you're trying to create something when the others aren't on board, you have to think about, how do I do this differently?
Katie, you just basically answered the question I was going to ask you both to wrap up this episode, which is, what was your main learning? And Kate, I wanted to throw this question at you as well, because we as coaches, we always grow, we develop. Every client is different. And so I'm curious, what was your takeaway? What was your personal growth as a professional coach that you experienced from this particular engagement?
I think there was a lot of moments where there was some reflective for me of how I was approaching the work with Katie, especially. And I think being able just to name some of the challenges and the trauma for me too was helpful, in that recognizing that there is value in giving people the space to be able to do that kind of recovery work in some ways. And that's, to be honest, when I decided I wanted to do coaching, that's not what I thought I was going to be spending time doing as much. And it has been, not just for Katie, but for others, part of what I've been doing. So really helping me reflect on how best to help people both name what's happening and then think about not necessarily changing things quickly or having a long list of things to do all at once, but are there one or two things we can try out just to see, and almost looking at it from an experimental standpoint, not a you have to do this, or this is what I say you should do kind of thing. I think being able to really hold that space and time is valuable when you're thinking about the transformation that you're trying to create. And so I guess for me, working with Katie was helpful in identifying some of that, because what all the words she's using around staff having agency and feeling like they're empowered to do the work, and that even she feeling that way, is not uncommon. I think I'm seeing that a lot across, especially in higher education. And I don't know if you are too, Tim, but I think, how do we really focus on what's the small transformation? And that's where the idea of paradigm twist is sort of really beneficial for clients to think about things that way too. It's smaller. It's not a list of 25 things or 50 strategic priorities. It's what are we going to try out here? And I think the transformation that can happen from that mindset and from that doing can be really valuable. And I found that really thinking about, how do I do this for Katie as I was preparing for the conversations, was valuable to me as well.
It's the ripple, right? A lot of times, you do these small changes in behavior, in mindset, in the way people communicate, interact, and then it really has a ripple effect on the entire team. So that's why I find fascinating. So I like to say, one client and one conversation at a time. That's how we create change. So the final question for both of you, in 3 words or less, what made your collaboration a great coaching relationship? Kate, I'm going to start with you.
Willingness, transparency, and effort.
What about you, Katie?
Paradigm twist.
I love it. Thank you both so very much for sharing your experience, for taking the time to talk about a dynamic that is very personal, that is very intimate in a sense, right? The coaching-client relationship. So I'm super appreciative that you were willing to open up and shine a little bit of a light of the dynamics in your collaboration, what you were working on, and also share with the audience why this was a truly successful coaching relationship. So thank you both so much.
Thank you, Tim. Great to be here.
Thank you.
And to our audience, thank you for spending a little bit of time with us today. I certainly hope you found this just as enlightening as I have. It's always fascinating to kind of peek behind the curtain in these coaching relationships. If you would like to get some more information on Kate, about this podcast, about some of our previous guests, and to watch some more episodes, please go to the companion site, which is higheredcoaching.us or leadershipimagined.com/podcast. And in the meantime, stay well and keep making a difference, one client and one conversation at a time. Take care.